I want to start with, well, the session is what we're watching. And what we've been watching, like all of you here, I guess, very closely for the past 5 months, are the impacts that we've seen as a result of war in Iran. Stephen, you manage our energy team here in Asia. You and your colleagues have been reporting and documenting many of the impacts that we've seen on energy markets, on supply chains. Which of those responses have we seen that have been sort of most acute? You know, what's short-term fix, and what are we seeing that's really going to deliver long-term change to the energy system in this part of the world?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, for us at Bloomberg News, the big event from late February onward has been the war in Iran and the closure or the near closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That has had a huge impact across the region. It's not only choked a fifth of seaborne oil supply, but also about 20% of liquefied natural gas supplies, most of it coming to Asia. And it's having a direct impact on how governments and companies think about the use of LNG and fossil fuels specifically in their energy mixes. So in some places, we've seen a knee-jerk reaction to double down on coal because it's available. In those places, we're seeing, for example, Japan had increased coal output and reduced LNG. But then in other places, we're seeing an acceleration in adopting renewables. Of course, this won't happen overnight. It will take time. But I think one of the countries that we looked at quite closely was the Philippines. It's been really fascinating seeing how the government has pushed forward policies to add more large-scale solar projects to the grid. But at the same time, you're seeing a response because the Philippines, the power prices are directly affected by oil, gas, and coal. They did see an uptick in electricity rates. I think only second to Singapore, their power prices are the highest. And you're seeing, because of that, a shift by households and businesses to also install solar panels. And the Philippines overtook Pakistan as the biggest importer of Chinese solar equipment for the first half of this year, which is really fascinating. You're seeing even in places like Vietnam and Thailand, where LNG imports were supposed to be part of a rapid growth engine well into the 2030s, some projects rethink whether or not to use LNG and to use renewables and batteries instead. And then other countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are being hit the worst by this, they're dealing with energy shortages and higher prices, and that's going to cause a radical rethink as to whether or not they can continue using these fossil fuels in the future. Let
me pick up on one of those points, but just before I do, and at the moment we can see a chart there showing that real influx of those solar imports to the Philippines that you mentioned. As I said, we'll make you work, and I think it's time that we have our first poll. We'll bring the poll up. As I said, do use the app to submit an answer, and then we'll bring you the results just in a few moments. We'll give you some time to do that. What we want to hear from you, we'll hear from our panelists, but how has the Iran war affected the clean energy transition in Southeast Asia? Is it speeding up as a result? Has it slowed down, or are you seeing no net effect? Steve, just to return to your comments, you mentioned Pakistan, Bangladesh sort of rethinking LNG purchases. How exposed are some of Asia's, I guess, for want of a better word, sort of more cash-strapped economies, you know, the ones that are more sensitive to price? How are they navigating it? How hard are they being hit?
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan received 99% of their LNG from Qatar last year. So suddenly overnight, they weren't receiving any shipments. There were, the way that they're dealing with it is, unfortunately, they had to implement some pretty long rolling blackouts. Load shedding is what they call it in some of the biggest parts of the country. You've seen them increase the use of coal. You've seen them increase the use of nuclear, actually. They were able to increase output above capacity at their nuclear power plant. But also, they're having to scramble to use potentially more renewables. That's driven not so much by government policy, but just the fact that if they're increasing power prices, increasing regasified LNG prices, that is forcing businesses to really look for ways to reduce their dependence on that fuel. Bangladesh as well has had to cut gas supplies to their fertilizer producers in order to make sure that there was enough gas going to power plants. So I think, for both of these regions, or both of these countries rather, it isn't a matter of kind of getting through this easily. This is quite literally an energy shortage. It's an energy crisis, and the way they deal with this, unfortunately, is to just cut energy use altogether.
Lili, if I can turn to you, we've talked a lot about Southeast Asia. You've been on the ground in China quite a lot in recent weeks. You've seen firsthand some of the nation's clean tech exporters. I guess the other side of the equation here has been the beneficiaries of some of the disruption we've seen. How are those companies, those clean tech exporters, how have they been benefiting from the disruption?
That's right. I cover China and climate change, so we've been watching this topic very closely. Will the Chinese companies be benefiting from the impact of the war? And the early signs we see are that the companies are receiving a tailwind from the war so far. And I think that's clearest with EV exports. I was actually in Beijing a couple months ago for the auto show that's held there every 2 years. And it was just wild to see all the Chinese companies trying to pivot to tackle the markets that are seeing oil shortages. And I talked to several automakers who said they were surging their sales teams to certain markets to try to find those new opportunities. So we saw really clear evidence of that. And it's borne out in the numbers too. We see the first half of the year that Chinese EV exports are up 120%. So I think that's the clearest sign we have across clean tech that Chinese companies are really benefiting so far. But it's also true in other technologies. So batteries in particular are seeing a big boom right now. And that's clear actually in Pakistan, where we saw this solar boom a couple years ago, but now batteries are following suit. So countries that are seeing these really high electricity prices, they want more stability. Short term, that might mean coal, but it also might mean investing in battery storage going forward so they can, weather these blackouts. Finally, for the solar piece, though, we're seeing sort of mixed signs. So in some countries like the Philippines, we've seen a real boom. As Steve said, a doubling of Chinese exports in this last 6-month period. However, the signs are a little bit mixed. So there was the end of a tax program in April. So we saw a huge surge of solar out of China. But then in the last two months, we've seen a bit of a dip since then. So we're still watching that very closely in terms of overall this year, will we see a surge in solar exports from China because of the war? So it's a little too soon to say.
I'll just pick up on there, but I don't know if we can bring back up the results of the poll, because that was quite surprising to me. There's a lot of optimism in the room this morning, and it was notable there. I think roughly 3/4 of respondents see the transition speeding up, which is really interesting. And I hope the discussions today we can maybe dig into some of the reasons why that's the case in this part of the world. Lili, you mentioned, I guess, the variance between some of the technologies. As you say, we saw that big sort of crest of solar exports. Maybe that's coming off slightly in places. But does that mean we're seeing a sort of concurrent uptick in batteries as people are generating renewable energy? Are we seeing, more users want to store and to really harness the utility of that?
Yes, I'd say certainly. So far this year, we see steady uptick with the batteries. And even just looking at the data from last month's exports, we see 50% increase year over year. And so that's been a steady trend. And the Chinese companies we've spoken to, they have acknowledged that they see sales increasing because of the disruptions from the war. So we expect to see that through the end of the year.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask you a final question on this issue, but before I do, let's ask the audience. I said we were going to keep you busy. One thing we're interested in, I guess, is some of the implications of that surge in exports of Chinese clean technology, and so we do have another poll. And I guess that the question is, whether we're seeing concerns and tensions. Is this wave, an increase in Chinese clean tech exports, a source of potential help to bolster energy security? Is it a national security risk? Is it neither of those things, or is it both? Very interested to hear your views. Lili, when you're reporting, talking to people, how much of a concern is that so for some nations, they could shift from reliance on fuel imports to reliance on Chinese technology?
Certainly. I think countries in this region, have some level of wariness over becoming too dependent on any given country for their supplies, as they've seen from this oil and natural gas shock from the Middle East. But I think they see the risks of clean tech dependence as different from oil and gas in that, it's a long-term build out of solar, and so there wouldn't be a sudden shock in the same way. And overall, if you look at the fears, I think, of national security risks from dependence on Chinese clean tech in Europe or the United States, I think it's much more acute. We've seen cancellations of factories, Chinese factories in the UK that would have been built to supply wind power there. And so there's a much more acute sense of risk around, having Chinese factories build in Europe or depending on those supply chains. I think here, what I see for the most part is an eagerness to embrace cheap solar and wind and to bring down power prices first and foremost.
No, fantastic. We'll come back when we do have some results of that polling. But Ishika, I kind of wanted to move on. We've talked to Steve and to Lili a little about sort of some of the short-term risks, sort of some of the steps that are being taken to manage things in the short term. You spent a lot of time recently talking to investors, to funds about medium and longer-term risks, issues around adaptation. How those longer horizon issues are impacting their strategy and investment decisions. What have they been telling you?
So for a story I did recently, I looked at sustainability reports of 12 of the biggest private equity firms in the world. And I would say that there's been a step change in how they're thinking about physical climate risks. Earlier, it used to be one of the boxes to tick when you're doing your due diligence for an investment, but now they're actually spending a lot of time. They're developing in-house tools. They're working with external climate risk analytics vendors. They're building out platforms for assessing and monitoring investments pre and post, of course, when they infuse the cash, to see what the exposure of the company and its assets around the world are to physical climate risks. And for example, EQT, when it was looking to acquire a waste management company back in 2024, it looked at how exposed the company's roofs, the waste management company's roofs were to extreme snowfall and typhoons. And
wow.
They decided to set aside cash in the future, cash for improving the roofs and making them more resilient. And this is exactly what a lot of PE funds are starting to do. They're setting aside more capital expenditure, more operating expenditure, in the future, of course, for the future. Or even working with some of these companies that they want to invest in and asking them to get insurance against their assets to make them investable. Because they see climate risks, many climate risks as acute. Usually floods and hurricanes come up a lot in those reports as the most immediate and acute triggers, but also extreme heat. So Brookfield, for example, is talking to companies about cooling needs, and they're building that into their models, like how much money is going to be spent on cooling. Partners Group called heat an extreme, or rather an acute risk as well. And the mentions of physical climate risks in these sustainability reports actually doubled in the 2025 reports from a year ago. And this is something that it's a business decision to spend time and money on identifying these risks, because they will affect exit outcomes for these private equity funds. So it's not a do-good strategy, or it's not altruism or anything like that. It's something that they can take to the C-suite and say, look, this is going to affect valuations on exit, so we have to do something about it.
Quite. No, that's we'll come back to that. I'm just conscious we had some results and some interesting results from our second poll. I don't know if we can bring them up again. I guess slightly reflecting there, Lili, what you were saying, that there certainly is some concern, and that's understandable. And I guess that's why we're seeing perhaps many of you in the room work on development of domestic supply chains as an alternative and a supplement to those Chinese clean tech exports. To shift back to adaptation, some of the themes that you've been looking at, Ishika, I guess we're also seeing, if not funds, investors take action, at least start to recognize and think through the implications of what we might think of as quite extreme risks. What JP Morgan have recently called sort of climate black swan events. Previously, these have been catastrophic potential risks that may have been seen as unlikely. We're seeing a shift in the investment space. Are people taking these things more seriously? Are they acting, or is it sort of think through the implications at this stage?
I would say that adaptation is still very much seen as state spend, but more and more private capital is starting to talk about it, is starting to assess it. I don't know how much money they're willing to put into the theme yet, because there aren't a lot of investable opportunities. That's the general narrative out there, though GIC says that this investment class of adaptation investments actually generates $1 trillion in revenue already, and that's going to quadruple to $4 trillion by 2050. So there's money to be made in places. Investors are looking at it both through a lens of risk and reward. I would say more so risk at this point, and slowly moving towards that reward side of things. For example, we talked about private equity funds, but even when we look at the global logistics industry, which is a $35 trillion dollar industry, they're looking at sensor technologies for tracking shipments real time. And this is important for perishables, for example, food and medicines. When you're transporting that, there's really low visibility on a real time basis on location and temperature that these goods are being transferred at. So there are companies developing that, and they're seeing 50% revenue growth on an annual basis. And they're seeing new investors come in. Wildfire risk management and technologies are seeing increased investor interest now, given everything that's happening in the US and Europe. So there are pockets that are starting to see more investor activity. I would say water management systems are another one. And what's helping the adaptation theme finally gain some recognition with private capital is the idea that it intersects with a lot of the other things that are exciting to the rest of the market, which is AI, for example. So making your grids more resilient. So sensor technologies for that, for example, or undergrounding cables, things like that. Investors are starting to find that it's an easy, funds are starting to find that it's an easy sell to their clients to say that, look, there's money to be made here. It's part of the AI theme, but it's also part of the adaptation theme, so that's helping.
You talked there about new technologies. I'm conscious that both yourself and Stephen, you both recently toured quite an interesting project in the northeast of Singapore that was deploying some pretty old technology to reduce the energy intensity of cooling, like a really key challenge when we think about extreme heat. I think we can see a photo. I'm not sure if you're in there. I think actually, Stephen, you may have taken that photograph actually. Stephen, what are we seeing? Can you describe what did you see and what was the intention?
Yeah, this is a district cooling system that was designed by Engie, the French company. They're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, district cooling equipment provider in the world. They worked on the one in Paris. I think it's the oldest or one of the oldest. And these pipes, essentially, they make water really cold, and then they send it throughout the building, and that cold water is sent through the air conditioning, essentially, to make all of the buildings in the area as efficiently as possible reach lower temperatures. And by, instead of, just using one of the cassettes or units per room that maybe we'll see in a lot of Singapore condos, this is, or in our office buildings where there's just one unit that sends the cold air through. This is for several buildings. It's for a whole campus. It was the
Singapore Institute of Technology?
Yes.
In Punggol.
In Punggol. What else did I miss, Ishika?
And Ishika, what's the climate benefit of using that kind of actually quite old-fashioned technology, but deploying it?
Yeah, so that the technology was first deployed in Denver in 1890, if I'm not wrong, for a meat cooling system or room or warehouse or what have you. To Steve's point about efficiency, so district cooling systems are supposed to reduce energy use by 30 to 50% because they're centralizing it in one unit. I would say that while we were touring this, what did cross my mind was the amount of water being used. It's crazy. There are gallons and gallons, like thousands of liters of water. So I feel like whichever country is looking to deploy this or whichever locality, you do have to study how water stressed that area is. But on the energy side, it's supposed to be much more efficient than having multiple buildings using multiple systems.
Fantastic. Do use the app, and if you haven't downloaded, do download that using the QR code to ask us any questions. We're very welcome to take questions. And while we see if you do have questions for us, Lili, I wanted to come back to your recent visits to China. You were on the ground recently in Mongolia, and I do think we also have an image of some of what you saw there. You really saw firsthand some of the, not necessarily tensions, but some of the variances that are playing out in China's energy transition. What did you learn?
So this was a really fascinating trip. I was just in Inner Mongolia last month, and I hadn't been there in over a decade. And I think if anybody is interested in the energy transition in China, you have to go visit Inner Mongolia. It's the place, it's really a microcosm for what's happening across the country. And what I was blown away by was just the scale of renewables that have been built in the last decade. So in this image, you can see this massive solar plant I visited, which is actually a small-scale solar plant for Inner Mongolia. It's like not even in the top 10, I think. So in the last decade, Inner Mongolia has become the #1 producer of wind energy in China. I think it's number 2 or 3 for solar. It's just everywhere you go. But at the same time, coal remains very, very dominant in Inner Mongolia. It's the number 2 producer of coal in China, and energy security is very important there. So I think my big takeaway from the trip is just, even with the incredible speed of China's renewable energy deployment, coal remains so dominant and central when you think about both central planners and also local governments in these coal regions. And what they're doing is they're basically changing the role of coal in the energy system rather than letting it fade away. And so in Inner Mongolia, that happens in 2 ways right now. One is in the power sector, we see renewables surging to cover new demand and even go beyond that to exceed new demand. But at the same time, Inner Mongolia is building more coal plants still than any other province in China. And for policymakers, that's about a concern that going forward with AI demand and other things, they may not be able to meet future demand with renewables, but it means a huge amount of coal plants are still coming online. And in the chemical sector, we see a huge surge, too, in use of coal for the production of chemicals instead of oil. Again, that goes back to energy security with the war. And so it really brings us back to this question about like the speed of China's energy transition going forward, whether or not policymakers can start to actually decrease the use of coal rather than just shifting it over to new uses.
Quite. And when we think about policy, and we've had a raft of not only the most recent 5-year plan, but we've recently had the sectoral 5-year plans. And that sort of built on this impression that China's climate policy remains quite cautious, quite measured. And yet we look at the emissions data and that shows improvement. We're seeing emissions fall, slowly, but fall. Just help us sort of understand, why is there that tension between goals and ambitions and the actual evidence that we see?
So last year, we did see emissions fall just a little bit in China, which may be the beginning of a turning point, but it is too soon to say because of what I just mentioned and saw in Inner Mongolia. With the rapid increase in energy demand from EVs, from factories, from AI, we see coal still being built. And so whether the power sector can continue to decarbonize in the coming years is a big question. And policymakers, as David, you just said, are very cautious. They want to make sure they can achieve their climate targets. And so they've set relatively conservative targets, both for 2030 in the new 5-year plans and for 2035 in their Paris targets. And, for some climate watchers, that's frustrating. They think China can push faster with the scale of deployment. But with these energy security concerns in these energy and climate 5-year plans, China's very clear. Coal is the backstop of the energy system. That doesn't mean it won't change to become more flexible to support renewables, but it is the backstop. And so going forward, they're looking at how can they maintain security while also starting to make sure they're using more of that renewable energy that was built in the last 5 years. So that means, moving AI data centers towards the west where there are a lot of renewables, making sure huge power lines are built to connect demand centers with the supply of renewable energy. So we're getting to a kind of trickier phase of the energy transition in China where it's not just build, build, build. It's starting to change the system to actually make sure it balances correctly and all of that. So a trickier phase.
No, absolutely. And look, as we sort of come towards the close of our session, I'm going to put all of you on the spot. If we were holding this session in a year's time, and hopefully past some of the volatility that we've seen as a result of the conflict in Iran, what then is going to be the most important driver of the energy transition? Will it still be energy security, or will decarbonisation and the climate agenda be back in the driving seat? Stephen, I'll give that to you first, if you can be brief.
Oh man, it's a good question. I think from where I stand, what I've seen has been the biggest driver has been just affordability. It's households and businesses. It's not so much energy security. It's trying to get the energy at the cheapest possible rate. You're seeing that in the Philippines. You're seeing that in Pakistan. And I think the driver of that is no longer going to be solar, which it was for a while. I think now it's going to be batteries. Yep. I think the big thing will be how can we make batteries cheaper on not just for BESS on a grid level, but also for households and businesses to get them installed and working well so that they can reduce their footprint and reduce how much they pay.
Mm-hmm. Ishika?
I think it'll... the results of the midterm elections in the US will have an impact on the decarbonization agenda there. But I would say in addition to affordability, accessibility, and there's so much discussion about grid investments, hopefully we'll see some of that play out in a year's time to see whether it's bringing down costs or whether it's working out as an investment thesis. But yeah, I think the US will set the agenda on how much climate policy will make an impact.
Lili, and
I would say both. I'm going to dodge the question and say both. I think from the China perspective, both of these themes are critical, and they can go hand in hand, but there will be tension, year by year, depending on what kinds of shocks we're seeing this year in particular. We're seeing that, as I said, surge in use of coal for chemicals because of the war. We may see, back steps like that going forward as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you all. Join me in thanking our panel, and really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks very much.
Great.